the stillness of a midnight sky over Burkina Faso, the silence was broken by the hum of drones. Within just 12 minutes, an operation unfolded that would not only shape the future of a single nation, but also challenge the very balance of power in Africa. This was not a random skirmish, nor an accident of war. It was a deliberate, historic strike ordered by none other than President Ibrahim Traoré himself. For the first time in Burkina Faso's history, the government admitted to launching a drone strike against an organized network operating inside its borders. But what emerged from the wreckage was not just debris. It was evidence of something far larger, a plan to cripple the backbone of the nation's future. Why would outside forces seek to dismantle Burkina Faso's hope of energy independence? What does this reveal about the struggle between Africa's sovereignty and global powers that still refuse to let go? This is not a story for the faint of heart. It is a story of courage, betrayal, and awakening. If you believe Africa's awakening has begun, subscribe and follow this journey until the end. The night of the strike began like any other along Burkina Faso's southeastern border, but just after midnight, surveillance detected an unusual convoy moving silently through the darkness. Within minutes, unmanned aerial vehicles were deployed. For exactly 12 minutes, precision drones hovered and fired, leaving behind burning wreckage scattered across the dirt road. What made this event unprecedented was not just the firepower, but the admission. The very next day, President Ibrahim went on record. The operation was real, and it was authorized directly by him. No denials, no vague statements. Just a clear confirmation that Burkina Faso had struck first, in defense of its sovereignty. Investigators who arrived at the scene were stunned. Among the ruins lay American-made rifles, French-manufactured radios, English maps, and even a Nigerian military ID, hidden within encrypted laptops and satellite phones. Data revealed connections far more complex, money flowing through shell companies in London, Paris, and Abu Dhabi. Over $75 million traced two accounts linked with contractors and private intelligence networks. Two codenames appeared repeatedly: Falcon Hand and DC Handler, pointing to a web of shadow operators beyond Africa's borders. This was no ordinary smuggling ring. It was the skeleton of an international plot, and for Traoré, the implications were clear. Burkina Faso was not just facing rogue militants. It was confronting a machine designed to But as shocking as the evidence was, the real storm was yet to come. Hidden in those files lay one target above all others: the Koudagou oil refinery, a $1.3 billion lifeline for the nation's future. What investigators uncovered from the wreckage was more than a collection of weapons and money trails. It was a detailed blueprint of Operation Broken Spine, an elaborate plot aimed at destroying the Koudagou oil refinery, Burkina Faso's most ambitious economic project to date. The Koudagou refinery, valued at $1.3 billion, was more than just an industrial facility. It represented independence, with the potential to generate $400 million annually. It promised to fund schools, hospitals, and technological innovation. For President Ibrahim, Koudagou symbolized the future of a sovereign Burkina Faso, a nation no longer at the mercy of foreign aid or imported fuel. But according to the seized documents, foreign-linked operatives planned to cripple Koudagou before it could begin production. The strategy was chillingly precise: coordinated sabotage, cyber attacks, and targeted explosions designed to make the refinery uninsurable and permanently stalled. This was not only an attack on infrastructure, it was an attack on the soul of his country. Standing before his council, he declared with a clarity that resonated across the nation: "If they send ghosts, we send thunder." By authorizing the drone strike, had not only intercepted a plot but also announced a doctrine. Burkina Faso would no longer wait to be struck. It would act first, decisively, and without apology. This moment marked the shift from defense to preemption, from being a pawn on the board to a player who writes his own rules. News of the drone strike and the revelation of Operation Broken Spine spread across Burkina Faso like wildfire. Within hours, thousands poured into the streets of Ouagadougou, waving flags and chanting his name. To them, this was not just a military action. It was a declaration of sovereignty. Mothers carried children on their shoulders, saying they wanted their sons and daughters to remember the night their nation stood tall. Artists responded with speed and passion. Murals of drones painted alongside the face of President Ibrahim appeared overnight on city walls. Musicians released tracks titled Thunder of Sahel and Kudegu Will Rise. In poems recited in markets, the strike became more than war. It became culture, myth, and inspiration. Across the Sahel, reactions rippled. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, people praised Burkina Faso for daring to confront forces that had long undermined African nations. Hashtags like #Sahel Rising and #AfricaDecide surged across social media, turning the operation into a continental rallying cry. But the international stage told a different story. Washington issued a cautious statement urging restraint, while Paris and Brussels warned that such actions threatened regional stability. Western media branded as unpredictable, hinting at a dangerous precedent if African leaders began striking back without consulting global powers. Still, for millions in Africa, the drone strike was a revelation that the old order could be challenged and that Burkina Faso had lit the spark. But this was no longer about one refinery or even one country. It had become a question of destiny. Could Africa truly reclaim its right to decide its own path? The aftermath of the drone strike reshaped the political landscape inside Burkina Faso almost overnight. President Ibrahim, already regarded as a bold leader, emerged as the face of a new doctrine. Uncompromising, unapologetic, and determined. His government described the action as the formal birth of what they called the Sahel Doctrine. The essence of this doctrine was simple yet radical. Any armed group or foreign operation on soil without transparent approval would be considered hostile, regardless of whether they carried the label of ally, peacekeeper, or contractor. In one stroke, Traoré erased decades of ambiguity that had allowed external powers to operate in the shadows. The public responded with unshakable loyalty. Citizens who once felt powerless now carried themselves with pride. Men and women filled the squares of Ouagadougou chanting, "Burkina Faso is free." Farmers in the north described the strike as a shield for our children, while teachers in the capital told their students they were witnessing a page of history. On social media, the surge of unity was undeniable. Hashtags like #SahelRising, #IronShield, and #AfricaNews trended across the continent, amplifying the narrative that the people of the Sahel were no longer silent observers, but active shapers of their own destiny. 4. The moment was more than approval. It was legitimacy. In the eyes of his people, he was no longer just the youngest leader in the world. He was the one who had dared to defend them before the storm arrived. While the political impact was immediate, the economic consequences unfolded like tremors after an earthquake. The Kudegu oil refinery was more than a national project. It was a fulcrum upon which Burkina Faso's future balanced. With the exposure of Operation Broken Spine, global investors froze, reassessing the risk of doing business in the South. Contracts worth $10 to $15 billion across energy, mining, and infrastructure suddenly came under review. Western corporations, particularly those tied to European and American capital, grew nervous. They saw in this assertive posture a refusal to play by the old rules of dependency. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Finance countered quickly, declaring that no foreign power would dictate the nation's economic choices, and that partnerships would only move forward under terms that safeguarded national sovereignty. For ordinary citizens, this moment was both pride and uncertainty. Farmers in Bobo Dioulasso celebrated the idea that their fuel would soon come from soil rather than French ports. Yet small business owners worried about sanctions, trade barriers, and inflation if the West chose economic retaliation. In Ouagadougou's markets, conversations about rice and fuel prices mixed with debates over the cost of independence. This duality framed a larger question. Was the drone strike a masterstroke of defense, securing future prosperity? Or was it a spark that might ignite isolation and economic siege? Supporters saw it as the bold act of a generation, necessary to protect sovereignty. Critics, even within Africa, cautioned that provocation could invite crushing external pressure before Burkina Faso had the resilience to withstand it. As the refinery stood ready to rise, one truth became undeniable. The world was no longer watching a small nation. It was witnessing the birth of a doctrine, and perhaps the reshaping of Africa's economic order itself. In Washington, the Burkina Faso drone strike landed like an unexpected thunderclap. Defense analysts who had long treated the Sahel as a peripheral theater suddenly found themselves debating a new reality. A small African nation had demonstrated not just access to advanced drones, but also the political will to use them preemptively. The Pentagon issued a carefully worded statement urging restraint, but internal memos leaked to the press suggested alarm at the NA-7 drone's 12-minute efficiency. For American strategists, the fact that this system combined North Korean design, Russian navigation, and African networking represented a nightmare scenario. The rise of a multipolar military ecosystem. Beyond U.S. influence, Paris reacted more sharply. French media called unpredictable, while officials at the warned that the strike threatened regional stability. Beneath the rhetoric, however, lay deeper fears. France had already been forced to withdraw troops from several Sahel bases under public pressure. Now, the very narrative of being Africa's security guarantor was collapsing. If Ouagadougou could field cutting-edge drones, what need was there for French protection? At NATO briefings, whispers turned into uneasy questions. Was the Sahel slipping permanently from Western orbit? Would Operation Iron Shield, the new alliance of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, evolve into a rival security bloc aligned with Moscow and Beijing? Financial markets shuddered. Energy companies, particularly those with holdings in West Africa, downgraded forecasts and warned investors of rising political risk. For the first time in decades, African assertiveness was not treated as a footnote, but as a variable capable of shaking global energy equations. Yet amid the unease, some voices in Washington quietly acknowledged a reality. The strike had exposed Western dependency on African resources more starkly than ever. To dismiss Burkina Faso as a minor player was no longer an option. While Washington and Paris wrestled with unease, other powers saw opportunity. In Moscow, analysts on state television hailed the strike as a turning point for Africa, portraying Burkina Faso as proof that multipolar alliances could succeed. Russian advisors, already involved in training and intelligence sharing across the Sahel, framed Traoré's doctrine as a model for resisting neocolonialism. Beijing's reaction was quieter but no less significant. Chinese state media highlighted the Coudegout refinery as an emblem of Africa's, stressing that infrastructure built outside Western influence was now defended with equal independence. Though China avoided direct endorsement of the drone strike, its diplomats hinted that they were ready to deepen trade and security ties with the AES bloc. In the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf states, the news was more complicated. On one hand, leaders in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh worried about their companies being linked to the Shell network's financing, Operation Broken Spine. On the other, they recognized the growing leverage of African energy independence. Some began discreet talks with Ouagadougou, eager not to be left out of the shifting balance. Across Africa, however, the impact was electrifying. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, commentators praised for breaking a psychological barrier, proving that a small African state could confront shadow networks tied to global powers and win. Student unions organized debates about sovereignty, while local media celebrated the phrase "don't mess with sovereignty" as a continental mantra. Globally, investors faced a dilemma. Should they retreat from the Sahel, fearing instability, or adapt to a future where African nations dictated terms? The NA-7 drone, with its precision and independence from Western supply chains, symbolized this new uncertainty. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a message that Africa could innovate, collaborate, and defend itself on its own terms. The world had to face an unsettling truth. The balance of power was shifting, not through speeches at the United Nations, but through a 12-minute strike in the night skies of Burkina Faso. The drone strike in Burkina Faso did not end with the smoldering wreckage of a midnight convoy. It planted a seed that began reshaping the entire security doctrine of the Sahel. The creation of Operation Iron Shield, the joint defense pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, marked the first time African nations openly declared that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. This was unprecedented. For decades, security in West Africa had been fragmented, often outsourced to foreign missions such as France's Operation Barkhane or UN deployments. Now, a locally led structure had emerged, funded not by outside donors but through pooled national resources and new partnerships with Moscow, Beijing, and even emerging players like Ang. The psychological effect was equally important. Citizens in the Sahel began to see themselves not as scattered populations dependent on foreign protection, but as part of a regional shield. University students in Ouagadougou and Bamako organized hackathons to improve ESNet, the encrypted network linking the three states. Farmers in Niger described the alliance as the shield above our fields. Politically, S doctrine emboldened other African leaders. Guinea sent observers to Iron Shield meetings, while Chad cautiously explored alignment. Even the Central African Republic signaled interest, suggesting that the Sahel might be the nucleus of a broader continental security framework. Yet this empowerment carried risks. Western think tanks warned that Iron Shield could become a magnet for sanctions, cyber warfare, or proxy conflicts. France, already squeezed by rising costs of intervention, faced the possibility of being sidelined completely. The U.S., wary of Russian and Chinese influence, began weighing whether to adapt, confront, or disengage. For the Sahel, however, one lesson was clear. Security subcontracted to outsiders was no longer sustainable. The future of sovereignty lay in cooperation born from within. The long-term consequences of Burkina Faso's 12-minute drone strike extend far beyond the Sahel. For the first time in modern history, a relatively small African state forced the world's largest powers to acknowledge that the rules of engagement had changed. The monopoly of high-tech warfare no longer belonged exclusively to Washington, Paris, or Moscow. With the unveiling of the NA-7 drone, Africa had entered the game not as a battlefield, but as a player. Global investors now face a new calculus. If African nations can defend their resources with advanced technology, then contracts, long tilted in favor of multinationals, may no longer be secure. Energy analysts estimate that if the Iron Shield model spreads, foreign corporations could lose $10 to $12 billion annually in easy profits extracted from Africa. The balance of bargaining power is shifting. From boardrooms in Europe to ministries in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. Culturally, the strike created an identity shift. Across Africa, young people no longer see sovereignty as abstract rhetoric, but as a principle worth defending with action. The phrase, "don't mess with sovereignty," became both slogan and doctrine, fueling music, murals, and digital movements. Narratives, once written in Western capitals, are now being rewritten in African streets. But the most profound impact may be psychological, by demonstrating that dignity could be codified into defense. As Burkina Faso challenged centuries of external dominance, the strike was not only a blow against a convoy, it was a warning to the structures that have long profited from Africa's weakness. Yet a haunting question lingers. Will this new doctrine inspire a continent-wide awakening, or provoke a storm of retaliation designed to crush it before it spreads? Will Africa's first shield endure against sanctions, cyber attacks, and covert wars, or will it fracture under pressure? The night drones cut through the silence above Burkina Faso may be remembered as the moment Africa drew its own red line. Whether the world respects it, or tries to erase it, will define the 21st century balance of power. The story of Burkina Faso's 12-minute drone strike is not just a military episode. It is a declaration. A small nation, often overlooked, proved that sovereignty is not granted by powerful states but defended by those willing to act. The NA-7 drone was more than a machine. It was a symbol that Africa can innovate, protect, and lead on its own terms. Yet symbols alone are not enough. The refinery at Koudagou still stands as both a promise and a challenge. The promise of energy independence and the challenge of surviving external pressure. The Iron Shield Alliance shows that cooperation can replace dependency, but whether it will endure against global countermeasures remains uncertain. For the world, the message is clear. The age of dismissing African agency is over. Every convoy, every contract, Every alliance will now be judged against the principle of sovereignty. That S-doctrine has made impossible to ignore. For Africans, the choice is sharper still. Will this moment ignite a continental awakening, or fade into memory under the weight of foreign pushback? The answer depends not only on leaders, but on citizens, the farmers, students, workers, and soldiers who must carry the shield forward. History rarely announces its turning points, but in the dark skies above Burkina Faso, one was written with precision and fire. And now the question passes to us, to Africa, and to the world. Will we stand back as spectators, or step forward as builders of a future where sovereignty is non-negotiable?